The rain came down in sheets that January night in Honolulu. It was 1893, and the harbor lights of the kingdom flickered against the black Pacific waters like the last embers of a dying fire. In the distance, anchored just beyond the reef, sat the USS Boston, a steel warship carrying 162 United States Marines. They had not yet received their orders, but they would. Inside Iolani Palace, Queen Liliuokalani sat alone in her private study. The woman was 54 years old. She had composed songs that her people still sang in the fields and on the shores. She had traveled to London to meet Queen Victoria. She had inherited a throne from her brother, and with it, the weight of a nation that had survived for centuries before the first foreign sail appeared on the horizon. She did not know, not yet, that this would be her final night as a reigning monarch. Across the city, in the back room of a law office, 13 men gathered around a single table. They called themselves the Committee of Safety, but there was nothing safe about what they were planning. These were not Hawaiian men. They were Americans, sugar planters, lawyers, businessmen, men whose fortunes had been built on Hawaiian soil, watered by Hawaiian rain, harvested by Hawaiian hands, but who considered themselves citizens of a greater destiny. They had a problem. The Queen had announced her intention to draft a new constitution, one that would restore power to the Hawaiian people and strip the foreign elite of the political control they had seized years before. To them, this was not reform. This was revolution, and they intended to crush it before it began. What happened next would unfold in less than 72 hours. A kingdom that had stood for over 1,000 years would fall without a single battle, without a single vote, and without a single Hawaiian voice being heard in the halls of power that sealed its fate. This is the story of how Hawaii was taken, not through war, not through treaty, not through the consent of its people, but through something far more insidious, a conspiracy dressed in the language of civilization, wrapped in the flag of democracy, and executed with the cold efficiency of a corporate takeover. The United States would call it annexation. The Hawaiians would call it theft. And the truth, buried for over a century, would haunt both nations long after the last queen was gone. To understand what was stolen, you must first understand what existed. For generations, Americans had been taught a simple story about Hawaii. It was a primitive place, they said, a scattered collection of islands ruled by tribal chiefs, waiting to be discovered, civilized, and saved. The missionaries came first, bringing the word of God. The businessmen followed, bringing the promise of prosperity. And eventually, inevitably, the flag of the United States would fly over these islands, not as conquest but as completion, as if Hawaii had always been destined to become American. This was the myth, and like all myths, it was designed to obscure a far more complicated truth. The Kingdom of Hawaii was not a primitive backwater. It was a constitutional monarchy, one of the first in the Pacific. It had a written constitution, a bicameral legislature, a Supreme Court, and a diplomatic corps that maintained treaties with the United States, Great Britain, France, Japan, and over a dozen other nations. Its capital, Honolulu, was one of the most important ports in the Pacific, a hub of international trade, whaling, and sugar commerce. The Hawaiian monarchy had navigated the treacherous waters of 19th-century imperialism with remarkable skill. When British ships arrived demanding concessions, the Hawaiians negotiated. When French warships bombarded Honolulu in 1849, the kingdom survived. When American missionaries sought to reshape Hawaiian society, the monarchs adopted what was useful and resisted what was not. They sent their princes to study in Europe. They built schools, hospitals, and churches. They created a written language and achieved one of the highest literacy rates in the world. By the 1880s, Hawaii was not a nation waiting to be saved. It was a nation that had already saved itself again and again from the imperial ambitions of larger powers. But there was one enemy the kingdom could not outmaneuver, one threat it could not negotiate away, and that enemy was already inside the gates. The sugar planters had arrived decades earlier, drawn by the rich volcanic soil and the favorable climate. They came from New England and California, men with capital and ambition, and they built plantations that stretched across the islands like green oceans of cane. Sugar became the lifeblood of the Hawaiian economy. And the men who controlled sugar came to believe that they should control everything else. They called themselves haoles, the Hawaiian word for foreigners. But they did not see themselves as guests in someone else's land. They saw themselves as the rightful stewards of a kingdom too weak and too primitive to govern itself. They formed clubs. They built mansions. They intermarried, creating a small, insular oligarchy that controlled nearly every major industry on the islands. And in 1887, they made their first move. It was called the Bayonet Constitution, and the name tells you everything you need to know about how it was created. Armed militiamen surrounded Iolani Palace. King Kalakaua, Liliuokalani's brother, was given a choice: sign the new constitution or face the consequences. He signed. The document stripped the monarchy of most of its powers. It transferred control of the government to the wealthy foreign elite. It imposed property requirements for voting that disenfranchised the majority of native Hawaiians while granting voting rights to foreign residents, including Americans who had never renounced their citizenship. In a single stroke, the haoles had taken over the kingdom without technically overthrowing it. They controlled the legislature. They controlled the courts. They controlled the economy. The king remained on his throne, but he ruled nothing. It was a dress rehearsal for what was to come. King Kalakaua died in 1891, broken and bitter. His sister ascended to the throne as Queen Liliuokalani, and she made no secret of her intentions. She would restore the power of the Hawaiian people. She would draft a new constitution. She would undo the damage of 1887. The sugar planters had anticipated this moment. They had prepared for it, and they had already decided what they would do. They would not negotiate. They would not compromise. They would not allow a Hawaiian queen to reclaim what they had taken. They would call in the Marines. The mechanics of the overthrow were remarkably simple. That was what made them so effective and so devastating. On January 14, 1893, Queen Liliuokalani announced her intention to promulgate a new constitution. She had gathered the signatures of the majority of her cabinet and the support of thousands of native Hawaiians who had signed petitions calling for change. By any democratic measure, she had a mandate. By any legal measure, she had the authority. But democracy and law were not the forces that would decide Hawaii's fate. Within hours of the Queen's announcement, the Committee of Safety convened. Their leader was a man named Lawrence Thurston, an American lawyer whose grandfather had been among the first missionaries to arrive in Hawaii. Thurston had spent years cultivating relationships in Washington, lobbying senators and congressmen, laying the groundwork for this exact moment. He had even met with Secretary of State James G. Blaine, who had assured him that if the proper conditions arose, the United States would look favorably upon annexation. The proper conditions had now arisen. The committee drafted a resolution calling for the overthrow of the monarchy and the establishment of a provisional government. They did not consult the Hawaiian people. They did not call for a referendum. They did not seek the consent of the governed. They simply declared that the Queen's government was subversive of the public peace, and that they, the Committee of Safety, were assuming control. But declarations alone would not be enough. They needed force, and they knew exactly where to find it. John L. Stevens was the United States Minister to Hawaii, the highest-ranking American official on the islands. He was not a neutral diplomat. He was a fervent believer in American expansion, a man who had written to Washington just months earlier arguing that Hawaii should become an American territory before some other power seized it. He saw the islands as a strategic prize, a gateway to Asia, a coal station and naval base for the American fleet. When the Committee of Safety approached him, Stevens did not hesitate. On January 16, 1893, he ordered 162 Marines from the USS Boston to land in Honolulu. They were not there to protect American lives. No American lives were in danger. They were not there to maintain order. There was no disorder. They were there to intimidate, to threaten, to make clear that any resistance to the coup would be met with the full military power of the United States. The Marines positioned themselves between the Queen's forces and the government buildings. They set up artillery. They faced Iolani Palace with bayonets fixed. The Queen's advisors urged her to resist. She had loyal soldiers. She had the support of her people. She could fight. But Liliuokalani understood something that her advisors did not. She understood that this was not a rebellion of Hawaiian citizens that could be suppressed. This was the United States of America, and if she ordered her soldiers to fire on American Marines, it would give Washington the excuse it needed to claim that Hawaii had committed an act of war. The response would be swift, overwhelming, and final. She chose to yield, but not to surrender. She issued a statement that would echo through history. I, Liliuokalani, by the grace of God and under the Constitution of the Hawaiian Kingdom, Queen, do hereby solemnly protest against any and all acts done against myself and the constitutional government of the Hawaiian Kingdom. Now, to avoid any collision of armed forces and perhaps the loss of life, I do, under this protest, and impelled by said force, yield my authority until such time as the government of the United States shall, upon the facts being presented to it, undo the action of its representatives and reinstate me in the authority which I claim as the constitutional sovereign of the Hawaiian Islands. She believed that when the American government learned the truth, that its representatives had conspired with a handful of businessmen to overthrow a sovereign nation, it would reverse the injustice. She was wrong. The provisional government wasted no time. Within days of the overthrow, a delegation was dispatched to Washington to negotiate the terms of annexation. They brought with them a treaty that would dissolve the Kingdom of Hawaii and transfer its sovereignty, its territory, and all its assets to the United States. The negotiations were not conducted between equals. They were conducted between an American administration that wanted Hawaii and a committee of American businessmen who controlled Hawaii. The native Hawaiian population, the people whose ancestors had built the kingdom, whose language named the islands, whose bodies had worked the plantations, were not invited to the table. Sanford Dole, the new president of the provisional government, was himself an American citizen. His father had been a missionary. His cousin would later become famous for growing pineapples. He dressed in formal European attire, spoke with the measured tones of New England respectability, and presented himself to Washington as the legitimate leader of a legitimate government. But legitimacy requires consent, and no one had asked the Hawaiian people whether they wanted to become Americans. President Benjamin Harrison was sympathetic. His administration had orchestrated similar arrangements before. The logic of expansion was simply the logic of the age. A treaty of annexation was drafted and submitted to the Senate. All that remained was ratification, and then history intervened. Grover Cleveland won the presidential election of 1892 and took office in March 1893, just weeks after the overthrow. Cleveland was a different kind of president. He was skeptical of imperial adventures. He believed in the rule of law. And when he reviewed the circumstances of the Hawaiian coup, he was appalled. He dispatched a special commissioner, James Blunt, to investigate. Blunt spent 4 months on the islands, interviewing participants, reviewing documents, and gathering evidence. His report was damning. The overthrow, Blunt concluded, was not a popular uprising. It was a conspiracy by a small group of foreign businessmen, aided and abetted by the United States minister and enforced by American troops. Without the presence of the Marines, the coup would have failed. The Queen had not been deposed by her people. She had been deposed by the United States government. Cleveland was faced with a choice. He could approve the annexation and become complicit in what he now understood to be an illegal act. Or he could attempt to restore the Queen to her throne and face the wrath of the expansionists in his own party. He chose neither. Cleveland withdrew the annexation treaty from the Senate. He publicly denounced the overthrow. He sent a new minister to Hawaii with instructions to negotiate the Queen's restoration. But when the provisional government refused to step down, knowing that Cleveland lacked the votes in Congress to use force, the situation reached a stalemate. The Republic of Hawaii was declared on July 4, 1894. Sanford Dole became its president. The Constitution of the new republic was designed to ensure that native Hawaiians would never again control their own land. Voting was restricted to those who would swear allegiance to the republic and renounce any loyalty to the monarchy. Property requirements excluded the poor. Literacy tests excluded those who had been educated in Hawaiian rather than English. The republic was a democracy in name only. It was an oligarchy of sugar planters, ruling over a dispossessed people, waiting for the day when a more sympathetic administration would complete what had begun. That day came sooner than anyone expected. In 1898, the Spanish-American War erupted. American ships sailed for the Philippines. American soldiers landed in Cuba. And American strategists suddenly realized what the sugar planters had always known. Hawaii was the key to the Pacific. Without Hawaii, the American fleet had no coaling station between California and Asia. Without Hawaii, the supply lines to the Philippines stretched across thousands of miles of open ocean. Without Hawaii, the United States could not become the Pacific power it aspired to be. The calculus had changed. What had been a moral question was now a strategic necessity. What had been an illegal overthrow was now a fait accompli. What had been a crime was now an opportunity. President William McKinley was not Grover Cleveland. He did not agonize over the circumstances of the overthrow. He did not commission investigations or seek the restoration of the Queen. He wanted Hawaii and he intended to take it. But there was a problem. The Constitution of the United States required that treaties be ratified by a two-thirds vote of the Senate. And despite years of lobbying, the annexationists could not muster the votes. Too many senators remembered the Blunt Report. Too many senators questioned the legitimacy of absorbing a nation whose people had never consented. So the McKinley administration found a different path. Instead of a treaty, they proposed a joint resolution. Joint resolutions required only a simple majority in both houses of Congress. They were meant for domestic matters, approving monuments, recognizing holidays, expressing the sense of Congress. They had never been used to annex a foreign nation, but there was no constitutional provision explicitly forbidding it. And in 1898, with American troops fighting overseas and patriotic fervor sweeping the nation, no one in Congress wanted to be seen as standing in the way of victory. The resolution passed the House on June 15, 1898. Passed the Senate on July 6. President McKinley signed it on July 7. Hawaii was annexed to the United States without a treaty, without a referendum, without a single vote from the Hawaiian people. Queen Liliuokalani, now a private citizen living under house arrest, watched as the Hawaiian flag was lowered for the last time over Iolani Palace. The Royal Hawaiian Band, which she herself had once directed, refused to play at the ceremony. Many Hawaiians stayed home. Their doors and windows shuttered against the celebrations. 1,000 years of Hawaiian sovereignty ended not with a war, not with a vote, but with a simple majority in a foreign legislature that most Hawaiians had never heard of. The kingdom was dead. The territory was born. And the truth of what had happened would be buried for nearly a century. The consequences of annexation were not abstract. They were not theoretical. They were carved into the land itself, written into the laws, and burned into the lives of the Hawaiian people. Consider, first, the Crown Lands. Under the Hawaiian monarchy, the Crown Lands were held in trust by the sovereign for the benefit of the nation. They comprised nearly 1.8 million acres, roughly 40% of all the land in the islands. These lands were not the personal property of the king or queen. They were the patrimony of the Hawaiian people, to be preserved for future generations. When the provisional government seized power, they claimed the Crown Lands as government property. When the Republic of Hawaii was established, they used those lands to reward their supporters and expand the sugar plantations. And when the United States annexed Hawaii, it absorbed the Crown Lands as federal territory, without compensation to the Hawaiian people, without recognition of their ancestral claims, without a single dollar changing hands. The Hawaiians lost their land twice, first to the oligarchy that overthrew their queen, and then to the empire that sanctified the theft. Consider, second, the Hawaiian language. For centuries, Hawaiian was the language of governance, of commerce, of poetry, and of prayer. It was the medium through which history was preserved, through which genealogies were recited, through which the relationship between the people and their land was expressed and understood. In 1896, the Republic of Hawaii banned the teaching of Hawaiian in schools. English became the only legal medium of instruction. Children who spoke Hawaiian were punished. Teachers who taught Hawaiian were fired. Within a generation, A language that had been spoken by an entire nation became the private possession of a dwindling number of elders. This was not an accident. This was policy. The architects of annexation understood that a people who cannot speak their language cannot remember their history. A people who cannot remember their history cannot claim their future. The suppression of Hawaiian was an act of cultural erasure, designed to make the islands American not just in law, but in memory. Consider Third Pearl Harbor. The Americans had coveted Pearl Harbor for decades. It was one of the finest natural harbors in the Pacific, deep, protected, strategically located at the crossroads of oceanic trade routes. The sugar planters had used it as a bargaining chip in their negotiations with Washington, trading access to the harbor for favorable tariff treatment. When Hawaii was annexed, Pearl Harbor became a United States naval base. The surrounding lands were seized under eminent domain. The indigenous fishing villages that had lined its shores for centuries were displaced. The sacred sites that had marked it as a place of spiritual significance were paved over, built upon, forgotten. Pearl Harbor would later become famous as the site of the Japanese attack that drew America into the Second World War. But long before the bombs fell, it had already been the site of another kind of attack. A quiet, legal, administrative violence that stripped the Hawaiian people of one of their most valuable resources. These three examples, the Crown Lands, the Hawaiian language, Pearl Harbor, represent only a fraction of what was taken. But they illustrate a pattern that would repeat itself across the decades. The conversion of Hawaiian wealth into American assets, the transformation of Hawaiian culture into American folklore, the reduction of Hawaiian people from citizens of a sovereign nation to subjects of an empire that would not even grant them statehood for another 60 years. Hawaii became a territory in 1898. It would not become a state until 1959. For 6 decades, the Hawaiian people lived under American rule without the rights of American citizens. Unable to vote for president, underrepresented in Congress, governed by officials appointed in Washington. They were colonized, and the colony was very profitable indeed. The sugar plantations expanded. The pineapple fields spread. American corporations Dole, Castle and Cook, Alexander and Baldwin C. Brewer, American factors, divided the islands among themselves like pieces on a game board. They called themselves the Big Five, and together they controlled not just agriculture but banking, shipping, real estate, and utilities. The Hawaiian people, dispossessed of their land, found themselves working as laborers on plantations that had once been their kingdom. They picked sugar cane under the burning sun. They processed pineapples in canning factories. They watched as their beaches were developed into hotels, their sacred mountains tunneled for water, their children taught to speak a language that was not their own. Immigration was encouraged, first from China, then from Japan, then from the Philippines, then from Portugal, to ensure a steady supply of cheap labor. The Hawaiian population, already decimated by diseases introduced by foreign contact, became a minority in their own homeland. By 1920, native Hawaiians comprised less than 15% of the population of Hawaii. By 1960, the figure had dropped below 10%. This was not genocide in the conventional sense. No army swept through the islands with explicit orders to exterminate. But the effect was the same. A people reduced, marginalized, and overwhelmed by the very forces that claimed to be civilizing them. The tourists came next. They arrived by steamship, then by airplane, drawn by the promise of paradise. The swaying palms, the azure waters, the exotic hula dancers who performed for their entertainment. They bought souvenirs made in China. They stayed in hotels built on sacred land. They photographed the remnants of a culture that had been deliberately dismantled and reassembled as a commercial attraction. The Hawaiians became performers in their own tragedy. They learned to smile for the cameras. They learned to drape leis around the necks of visitors who could not pronounce their names. They learned to say aloha to people who had no idea that the word meant not just hello and goodbye, but love. A love for family, for land, for ancestors, for a way of life that was slipping away with each passing year. And in Washington, no one talked about what had happened in 1893. No one mentioned the Blunt Report. No one acknowledged that the annexation had been illegal, that the people of Hawaii had never consented, that the United States had violated its own principles in pursuit of empire. The silence lasted for 100 years. In 1993, Congress finally spoke. 100 years after the overthrow, both houses of Congress passed a joint resolution, the same mechanism that had been used to annex Hawaii, apologizing for the role of the United States in the illegal overthrow of the Hawaiian monarchy. The resolution was signed by President Bill Clinton. It acknowledged that the landing of the Marines had been an act of war. It acknowledged that the provisional government had been established with the support of the United States. It acknowledged that the native Hawaiian people had never directly relinquished their claims to sovereignty. For the first time in American history, the United States government admitted what the Hawaiian people had known all along, that their kingdom had been stolen. But the apology came with no remedies. No land was returned. No reparations were paid. No pathway to sovereignty was established. The resolution expressed regret, acknowledged injustice, and then nothing. The words hung in the air like a promissory note with no due date. Some Hawaiians organized. They formed sovereignty movements, drafted constitutions, held elections for a government that the United States refused to recognize. They pointed to international law, to the precedent of other indigenous peoples, to the simple principle that a nation taken by force should be restored when the force is acknowledged to be illegitimate. But the forces arrayed against them were formidable. The military had built dozens of installations across the islands. The tourism industry generated billions of dollars in revenue. The real estate market had transformed Hawaiian land into some of the most valuable property in the world. Too many interests depended on Hawaii remaining exactly what it was: a state of the Union, subject to American law, integrated into the American economy, defended by the American military. The apology, it turned out, was not a beginning. It was an ending. It was the final word of a story that the United States had no intention of reopening. And so the Hawaiian people remain, citizens of a country that admits it took their nation by force, residents of a land that was never legally ceded, descendants of a kingdom that exists now only in memory. They are the evidence of a crime that was confessed but never punished. They are the living reminder of a promise that was never kept. They are the heirs of Queen Liliuokalani, who died in 1917 still believing that justice would one day be done. History is not simply what happened. History is what is remembered, what is taught, what is carved into monuments and inscribed into law. And for a century, the history of Hawaii was rewritten by those who had taken it. The overthrow became a revolution. The annexation became inevitable. The Hawaiian people became grateful beneficiaries of American civilization. The sugar planters became pioneers. The Marines became peacekeepers. This version of history served a purpose. It justified what had been done. It absolved those who had done it. It transformed a crime into a destiny, a theft into a gift, a violation into a liberation. But the truth has a way of persisting. It survives in the songs that the Hawaiian people still sing. It survives in the language that, against all odds, is being revived in schools and communities across the islands. It survives in the oral traditions, the genealogies, the stories passed from generation to generation about what was and what might have been. And it survives in the simple fact that every piece of land in Hawaii was once Hawaiian. Every beach, every mountain, every valley, every sacred grove where the bones of ancestors were laid to rest. The American flags that fly over these places cannot change what they were. The English names that have replaced the Hawaiian names cannot erase what they meant. The United States took Hawaii without a vote because it knew what the vote would be. It understood that the Hawaiian people, if asked, would choose their own kingdom over foreign rule, their own queen over an imposed president, their own future over the plans that had been made for them in distant boardrooms and legislative chambers. The silence of the Hawaiian people was mistaken for consent. Their patience was mistaken for acceptance. Their survival was mistaken for surrender. But they did not consent. They did not accept. They did not surrender. They endured. And in their endurance is a judgment more powerful than any court could render. A verdict delivered not in words but in presence, not in protest but in persistence, not in anger but in the quiet, unbreakable insistence that a people who remember their past cannot be robbed of their future. Iolani Palace still stands in the heart of Honolulu. It is now a museum, open to tourists who walk through its restored rooms and marvel at the elegance of a court they never knew existed. They see the throne room where King Kalakaua hosted balls in the European style. They see the private chambers where Queen Liliuokalani was held prisoner after a brief attempt to restore the monarchy. They see the basement where she was confined, with only a cot and a Bible, while the men who had taken her kingdom went about the business of consolidating their power. At night, when the tourists have gone and the docents have locked the doors, the palace is dark and silent. The trade winds stir the palm trees in the courtyard. The lights of modern Honolulu glitter in the distance. Hotels and office buildings and shopping centers built on land that once belonged to a queen. If you listen closely, some say you can still hear the songs she composed during her imprisonment. Songs of love for her land. Songs of grief for what had been lost. Songs of hope that one day, somehow, her people would be free. The United States of America never admitted what it did to Hawaii. It apologized, yes. It acknowledged the facts, yes. But it never surrendered what it took. It never restored what it destroyed. It never asked the Hawaiian people what they wanted. Not in 1893, not in 1898, not in 1959, and not today. Some nations are conquered by armies. Some are conquered by economies. Some are conquered by laws. And some are conquered by silence, by the refusal to speak of what was done, by the insistence that the past is past, by the comfortable fiction that what is was always meant to be. Hawaii was conquered by all of these, and it remains conquered still. But kingdoms do not die so easily. They live on in the blood of the people who built them. They live on in the language that refuses to disappear. They live on in the memory of a night in January, when a queen chose peace over war, believing that truth would be her weapon and justice her shield. She was wrong about justice. The justice she hoped for never came. But she was right about truth. The truth has survived. It has outlasted the men who overthrew her, the presidents who ignored her, the corporations that profited from her fall. It is being taught again in schools. It is being spoken again in homes. It is being written again in books and films and speeches. The truth is that Hawaii was taken without a vote. The truth is that the United States knew it was wrong. The truth is that the Hawaiian people never forgot. And the truth is that history is not finished. Continues to unfold. Continues to demand. Continues to ask the question that was never answered. What does America owe to the kingdom it destroyed?